Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the 7th webinar for the Teacher Effectiveness Series. Today's webinar is on classroom observations to measure teacher effectiveness, and it's being hosted by the Regional Educational Laboratory of the Mid-Atlantic. In order to minimize disruptions throughout the webinar, we'll be muting the line. I'm Elizabeth Greniger, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Our featured presenters today are Rob Ramsdell and Christy McInnis from Cambridge Education. This webinar series is a forum for us to provide stakeholders in the Mid-Atlantic region with opportunities to discuss multiple topics within the field of teacher effectiveness. This is our 6th webinar, and many of you I see have been attending some of our prior webinars, so you're understanding that the goal of this series is to increase our participants' understanding and use of the research-based teacher effectiveness strategies. So now we'd like to take a moment to find out who is joining us on the webinar today. In a moment, you'll see a pop-up box come onto your screen with a multiple choice question. Click on the answer choice that best indicates your professional role. Looks like we have a pretty diverse audience today with quite a few researchers joining us and a good number of teachers and other school district staff. We know that the content of today's presentation will really speak to all people who are working in any capacity within school districts and states. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters. We have with us today Mr. Rob Ramsdell from Cambridge Education. He serves as the Vice President of School Improvement Services at Cambridge Education. He also leads the Tripod Project for School Improvement as a leading expert on educator evaluation with its founder, Ron Ferguson. Mr. Ramsdell started his career as a high school social studies teacher and founded Fresh Pond Education in 1996, which then joined Cambridge Education in 2007. Mr. Ramsdell also served as Senior Director of PBS TeacherLine, an online professional development initiative funded by the U.S. Department of Education. He has experience working with hundreds of schools and districts to design and implement high-quality school improvement programs and professional development initiatives. Also joining us today as a co-presenter is Christy McInnis. Christy serves as a senior education consultant for Cambridge Education. In her work, she develops and leads school improvement efforts primarily focused on improving school leadership, teacher instruction, and student learning, using teacher and principal evaluation as the vehicle for assisting districts in identifying areas of needed improvement. Ms. McInnis began her career in 1989 as an English teacher in Okaloosa County, Florida. After 14 years of teaching grades 6 through 10, she assumed a school leadership position, allowing her to facilitate improvements in curriculum and instruction in one of Florida's top-ranked high schools. Prior to joining Cambridge, she served as Okaloosa County School District's Director of Professional Development, Teacher and Principal Evaluation, New Teacher Induction, and Certification. At this time, I'd like to pass the presentation along to Rob.
Great. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth, and it's a privilege to be here today. And I just want to say a moment more about my experience and what's brought me into this particular work with educator evaluation. As Elizabeth's introduction highlighted, my work is mainly focused on the Tripod Student Survey, working closely with Ron Ferguson, who I think many of you heard from on a webinar earlier in the series. But through that work and our involvement with the MET project, we've had the opportunity to get heavily involved in work related to effective classroom observation as well, which has also been a specialty of Cambridge Education's, both here in the U.S., but also work internationally where we support school improvement and work related to educator evaluation across about 45 countries. So it's really my role here today to kind of set some context for the webinar and quickly get it over to Christy, who has much more recent and deeper experience with classroom observation, and will be able to share insights both from her experience at Okaloosa, but also the work she's doing out in the field in a number of states supporting districts around this particular issue. For today's session, I just want to emphasize, and I want to highlight, we received questions from people who shared those with us during the registration process. And the range of questions was significant, and we're hopeful that we'll address many of the issues that were raised in those questions. But I think we're assuming going into this conversation that we have an audience that has a lot of understanding about issues related to classroom observation already, and we're hoping this webinar provides an opportunity to build on what is likely already a significant understanding by giving us some time to focus in on this particular issue, to look at some of the research implications involved with this work, to dig a bit into the issue of feedback, so not just the process of observation, but what happens after observations to support professional learning, and also through the kind of polling and interactive work we'll do throughout the presentation, give folks an opportunity to reflect on what you're seeing in your local districts. Now with that, thanks to the initial poll, I want to acknowledge that we have a lot of researchers who may not have, I think about 50% of the participants here are researchers who may or may not be working directly in a district. And what I'd ask you all to do is sort of try to situate yourselves in a district that you're most familiar with, because in a number of the polls that we'll be doing during the session, we'll be asking you to reflect on what's happening in your district. And if you're in a district supporting a range of districts, then we'll want you to kind of try to situate yourself in a district you're most familiar with and respond based on that particular experience and perspective. The session is going to be broken up into 4 sections. In the middle here of the introduction, where I'll be trying to set the context for our time together. Christy will then dig into some of the essentials of effective classroom observation. We'll then focus a little bit on the issue of reliability and the benefits of multiple observers. And then Christy will come back in and focus on issues related to quality feedback and making the link to high-quality professional learning as part of the observation process. So I think most people on this call are probably here in part because you're in environments where there is a shift of some sort occurring, a shift to focus differently on classroom observation and to develop the work of classroom observation, particularly in relating it to new teacher evaluation and educator evaluation systems. Now, we're all also probably aware that the quality of teaching is the single most important factor in student learning, and this is what's driving a lot of the emphasis on changing and improving teacher evaluation systems such that they are rigorous, valid, and reliable, and trusted by all stakeholders. But as we're thinking about this work, and particularly the focus on classroom observation, but more broadly the work that's happening across the country around new teacher evaluation systems, we need to acknowledge that that work isn't occurring in a vacuum. And what I'm going to do here is just quickly build with the outcome ultimately that we're all focused on as at the top here with student achievement, but as measured by a range of different types of achievement. So not just measured by tests, but also attitudes and behaviors, educational attainment, employment, and citizenship. And I think probably most all of us on the call today would agree that the way we get there is not just by improving educator evaluation systems and classroom observations, but rather by building strong district leadership and organizational capacity, supporting strong school leadership and organizational capacity, promoting effective learning environments and engaged students with the involvement of families and communities. In the conversation today about observation, we're particularly focused on the issue of effective student learning environments and engaged students. But up front, I want to acknowledge that that this work of classroom observation and the focus on effective student learning environments and student engagement is occurring in this wider context. So we're all aware that teacher evaluation systems are changing across the country in a range of ways, whether it's adding multiple measures or advancements in important work like we see in the advances in the Framework for Teaching rubric of Charlotte Danielson, to the different forms of consequences that are tied to educator evaluation and the role of classroom observation in that observation process. And we're going to quickly do a poll just to try to gauge what kinds of changes you're experiencing in the districts and settings that you're working in. And this, again, is where I'd ask the researchers and other stakeholders on the audience to try to situate yourself in a district that you're most familiar with when responding to this polling question that's going to appear momentarily.
Okay, so like Rob just mentioned, we'd like you to respond to the question, what changes in teacher evaluation are taking place in your school or district? And you can click more than one response if multiple responses apply to your situation. Okay, so there's quite a range of things happening in teacher evaluation across the schools and districts we have represented. It looks like quite a few people are using evaluation criteria in their student standardized test scores, a good number of us. Looks like fewer people are including incentives for strong performance on evaluations at this point. Rob, did you have any thoughts on what you see here in the responses from the audience?
No, it looks as though we had a pretty good list in that these are the things that folks are experiencing, and just to acknowledge that it's a wide range of issues. I'd like to maybe highlight the bottom item. There are supports, interventions, trainings available for teachers who perform poorly on evaluations. Not that it's low, but it is one of the lower areas of the options selected. Perhaps that was because it was at the bottom, but as we go through today's presentation and try to really focus on the step of making sure that evaluations and classroom observations support growth and professional learning, hopefully we'll come back to this issue of what kinds of supports are in place to follow up and support what we're learning through the observation process. I think we can hide the poll now. So certainly one of the things that that districts and states across the country are focused on in this shift is the emphasis on multiple measures. And I think, again, a number of you were participants in the webinar where Ron Ferguson shared some of the experience with the tripod surveys. Of course, we have value added and growth data in the mix. and today with our focus on classroom observations. But with all of this, we just want to continue to keep the focus on the outcome that we're aiming for in implementing educator evaluation systems, which is more engaged students and higher achieving students across the range of achievement outcomes that we all care about. I think everyone's probably aware of why this shift is happening. There's certainly a recognition that past evaluation systems have lacked rigor, both in their thoroughness and accuracy, and that has undermined the credibility of the evaluation systems. The quality of feedback available to educators and teachers in particular has been limited, and there are a range of policy issues that have fueled a lot of the changes that we're experiencing across the country. Now, this next slide sort of presents a theory of change here, with the notion that better classroom observations will provide more rigorous evaluations that have higher levels of thoroughness and accuracy, building collegial feedback and professional learning. And I'll just pause for a moment and ask you to reflect on whether all three of these areas are receiving equal attention in the settings where you're working. Certainly our experience is in many settings, there's this very, very strong emphasis on the evaluation system, but there has not yet been as much of a focus on the next step of building the kind of collegial feedback and professional learning that will actually fuel improvement and growth in our classrooms and in our schools. And that will be a theme that we'll come back to during the presentation today. So as we think about this work and move towards transitioning to Christy, digging into more details on the effective classroom observation work that she's been involved with and others are involved with, I think what we're aiming for here is a system and classroom observation approaches in particular that move us from an emphasis on evaluation to a system that finds greater balance and provides a picture that looks more like this. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Christy to dig in a bit more on the effective classroom observation work that she's been involved with.
Thank you, Rob, very much. Just kind of hinging on what Rob shared just a moment ago, as we're thinking about observing teaching and evaluating teaching, we start to move into our quest to just continuously analyze student learning. So as we start thinking about the effective classroom observation and what the essentials are for that process, I like to sometimes think of those essentials as being sort of a checklist. And although we know that teaching is far more complex than a checklist, there's just this kind of philosophy I have in thinking about an analogy like pilots in the cockpit of an airplane. Prior to takeoff, they use a checklist to be sure that all of the important steps and procedures have been completed before they dare take off on that runway. So they want to make sure that there's a successful flight, and they do that with that checklist. So similarly, there are procedures that we can follow when using classroom observations to ensure that we have more successful teacher instruction and student learning taking place in the classroom. So many of the things you see here on this list are going to certainly be some of the topics that we're going to cover throughout the presentation. So the effective classroom observation, several different steps in that, and when we think about observation, it's not just the act of going into a teacher's classroom in and of itself and observing the teacher's practice. There are several key steps that we have to make sure that we have in place in order for us to really have that improved student learning. We're seeing a lot more feedback, collegial conversations being held within schools, certainly between administrators and the teachers, and then certainly among the teachers themselves through the use of a lot of their PLCs and certainly common planning time, where they're just really having an opportunity to have the more quality conversations with one another about student learning, and certainly from the observer or evaluator standpoint as well. And certainly that feedback is used to drive targeted professional learning for our teachers, and that is beneficial only when it's individualized to the teacher. So when we go in and we do these observations, it's not about a mass or global approach to the entire school per se of educators, but certainly targeting the needs of each individual teacher so that we can be sure that their areas of focus are addressed for specifically what their needs are. And then, of course, by this process all tying together and ensuring that we have each of those steps, we're more likely to get to that goal of improving our student learning. So, you know, certainly the goal of effective classroom observation is to increase that student learning. And when we follow the steps and procedures and processes of a solid observation process or cycle, then we're more apt to get to that student learning that we're seeking to have. There are numerous kinds of observations, certainly, that can be used. And I know there were a lot of questions about different types of observations that came in prior to the webinar today. So it was great to see some of the questions that you had kind of circulating around the different types of observations, and certainly what some of these purposes are. The biggest thing that we have to keep in mind is that observation is not a gotcha or a gotcha process. You know, sometimes how we build our school culture is going to determine the exact success that we're going to have in an observation process or in the cycle. The formal observation in and of itself, as I shared a while ago, is certainly not the only way that we're going to collect the data that we need. Formal observations, most often, as far as length goes, 30 to 60 minutes, or certainly a class period. It's an opportunity for an observer to see the beginning, the middle, and the end of a lesson so that you get that full picture of how the teacher introduces new content, provides that series of learning and instructional strategies for the student, and then how they wrap that up at the end and assess what the students have learned. It most often is accompanied by the pre and the post-conference, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in just a moment. The informal observation and the walkthroughs are certainly something we're seeing more of. As a result of the MET study, we found, of course, that, or it was discovered that, you know, more frequent and shorter observations had a tendency to provide a better picture of what was actually happening in classrooms rather than taking that one opportunity for a formal observation. Because as most of you know, on many occasions when we go in for that formal observation, it has been something that the teacher has had quite an opportunity to rehearse perhaps. Even in the pre-planning piece of that, they've had, you know, time at length to certainly plan and develop that lesson, and good planning we know is certainly key to effective teaching. However, the formal observation in and of itself can certainly make you feel as if you're getting that dog and pony show that we so often refer to it as. But it's really the informal observations that are unannounced and those walkthroughs where we often gather the most evidence that gives us a truer picture of the teaching. So I know many districts are using informal observations to help provide that truer picture, those unannounced visits when they can go in and gather evidence to support the areas within the domains that are being observed. And then the walkthroughs are most often used, of course, to support the observation findings previously or to add to get a better picture of the summative evaluation that comes at the end of the year. Now, one thing that I've noticed recently with the walkthroughs is that there has certainly been kind of an interpretation that leans more towards the inappropriate side, just from the standpoint that teachers, you know, will view that as an inspection, snoopervision, as I've heard it called by some educators. When the principals or administrators, evaluators walk through for those impromptu walkthrough observations, you know, they say it's snoopervision day if they know the administrators are out and about. So we have to work to eliminate that feeling of snoopervision or that teachers are being inspected checking on, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But it's got to be more of a means of supporting and motivating our teachers and encouraging them because it's all about reflecting on their practices. So rather than that inspection, which will often stop teachers from wanting to have those collegial conversations and seek to grow professionally, we have to switch that culture and environment to understand that this is an opportunity to motivate our group of teachers and to really support them and to help them learn to reflect more on their teaching practices as we've never done before. And I was glad to see a while ago that in the survey there was a certain percentage, I believe we had about 38% say that there have been more opportunities for conversations around instruction, but that certainly is a percentage that we would like to see increase because that is really one of the areas that helps to bring, I think, that support and collegial atmosphere to the observation process and the opportunity for professional growth. And we'll certainly address feedback a little bit more here shortly as well. So thinking back to what I said a moment ago about the formal observation process, this is the one traditionally where we do have that opportunity to meet with the teacher on the front end and find a little bit out about what exactly the lesson is going to entail and to which part of their curriculum that lesson relates. We're looking for those connections with their standards and how that particular learning that we're going to be hearing about on that particular day fits into the sequence of learning for that class. It's an opportunity to learn about the environment and the culture of the students that the teacher has and what type of differentiated instruction we can expect. So that gives us the information on the front end to do a better job of observing in the classroom once we know pretty much how the teacher is planning to handle certain groups of students. And of course, the observation in and of itself, we're going in, we're collecting all of our information and thinking about that observation information in terms of a cause and effect relationship. Because the teacher is saying or doing one thing, the students are learning something as a result of that. And that is truly what that observation is about, what the students are learning. So because of what the teacher is doing, what kind of student learning and to what degree are we seeing? And, of course, the post-observation conference we know is our opportunity to have that reflective type conversation with the teacher and talk about strengths and areas of improvement that are going to be needed. And the next steps, which are crucial to providing a teacher, because it's not enough to certainly go in and say this is what went well or this is what we need to improve on, but they need to know they've got that support and opportunity from their administrator to help them get to that improvement. So when we think about the target outcomes of effective classroom observation, the key piece here is what I think has held us back, as administrators are sharing with me throughout the U.S., is that there hasn't been that shared understanding of what good teaching actually looks like. Teachers have not minded so much being observed, given that they know what they're being observed on, and that they have that same clear understanding of what good teaching and good instruction actually looks like. So that's the piece that seems to have been missing up to this point, is just that common shared understanding of what that effective instruction piece is. And certainly, of course, you can continue to look through some of these that are here. The calibration piece, this has been monumental in many of the districts that I've been working with lately. Teachers, given the newness of the new effective evaluations or the processes that states have been asked to develop, this probably has been one of the areas that teachers have said have really helped to give them that sense of trust from the people who are observing them. They're concerned very much, or have been, about the training that administrators or other evaluators have received that would make them qualified, per se, if you will, to be the rater of their instruction. So the calibration piece that many districts have opted to do, where they have had training with other administrators or evaluators on how to gauge between one performance level and another, discerning whether or not a teacher is needing improvement or developing versus effective, or effective versus highly effective. Having the chance to train, really ascertain what each level looks like and sounds like in a classroom, and then make those ratings of a teacher. So that formal calibration process has brought a lot of trust to the process of observation, and then of course the assigning of those summative evaluation ratings. So many districts have been saying this has been the best move that they have made. And then after the calibration process, and some districts are going through recalibration year after year, have opted to do that to keep that trust and regard for the process, especially with the pay-for-performance issues that are so prevalent throughout many districts and states now. So they're doing the calibrations, the recalibrations every year, and then engaging in some deeper trainings every 2 or 3 years in between that. The calibration process, when we think about what quantifies or qualifies, I guess, as a true calibration process and what's the extent of training needed, we're finding that usually at least a minimum of 10 observation practices is a good start for sure for administrators who are going to be evaluating, or evaluators who will be observing teachers. Done through small groups or individually, just really making sure that there's that emphasis on the quality of the evidence that's collected. Because a lot of times we can be in classrooms, and I'm working with some administrators now in one of the Florida counties who are having a difficult time collecting the evidence of student learning that actually connects to components and indicators within their evaluation framework to accurately support the level or the rating that's given. So I think that just making sure that we have an adequate amount of practice observations that these evaluators are taking place in, making sure that there's quality on the evidence collected, and not just enough about, not just saying that we can make an accurate rating for a teacher, but why and how are we getting to that? Because that's what teachers want to most be assured of. If you're telling them that they are needing improvement or developing, they want to know the evidence that was collected, and it can't be those opinions about what we think or we feel, or just kind of a bias as well. So we've got to keep that connected to the evidence of student learning. Master-coded videos are another great way to increase the accuracy that we are most often finding can certainly be inconsistent throughout districts and certainly throughout states. Master-coded videos, though, are not just videos that perhaps as a district, a group of administrators or district staff members have gotten together and have watched and rated on their own. When we talk about master-coded videos, we're talking more about videos, for example, from Charlotte Danielson through her partnership with Teachscape, that have been actually reviewed and then master-coded by her team of qualified researchers who have certainly been trained and have worked to be able to provide those ratings for the videos of lessons of teachers teaching, as has Marzano. I know that Robert Marzano's team with LSI have certainly, or iObservation, have worked to provide some of those master-coded videos as well. So you have to make sure here on this part that they truly are master-coded, in that they have been done by someone of a higher authority than just a district staff or a group of administrators who have come to a consensus perhaps about what a rating may be for a teacher. Rob, I believe this is the part where you're going to be picking up here and talking about self-assessing our district.
Great. Thank you, Christy. And one of the resources that is available in the middle of the screen down at the bottom, you should see a tab that says resources. I know that at least one person is having trouble has had some trouble downloading the PowerPoint. I'm sure we can follow up and get you that. But for those that are able to access the resources, we've provided a self-assessment tool that's a resource that we've been developing over the past several months based on input from a range of districts, and we hope you'll find thought-provoking and useful. And the notion here is that as we think about effective classroom observation and the different activities that need to be put into place to ensure that a school system has good capacity around effective classroom observation, there are a number of indicators that we can look at and reflect on as school systems. And so if we can, we're going to actually give you a quick poll. And again, for those researchers that are on, I'd ask you again to try to situate yourself in a district that you're most familiar with. But an example of one of the indicators on this self-assessment rubric is around the issue that Christy was just sharing with us. And so the indicator is accreditation for observers is based on rigorous competency requirements. Now, we've only shown you level 2 and 4 in a 4-point rating that you might give each of these indicators. So just to say that we're going to ask you in a moment to say whether you think your district is at a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4, but we're only giving you examples here of the 2 and 4 levels. So if you think you're below 2, then you put a 1. If you think you're kind of between 2 and 4, of course you put a 3. But so for a 2 level, accreditation is based on attendance and training events and does not require evidence of accuracy in rating levels of performance. And what we mean there is accreditation of classroom observers. Whereas a level 4 is the accreditation process consists of a range of assessments which measure the trainee's ability to implement all aspects of the observation process. There is a strong emphasis on accuracy in lesson observation, and there is a rigorous means of assessing whether observers rate lessons accurately. And the emphasis here on accuracy is it's not that we have a group of administrators that are all agreeing with each other, because they may agree with each other and all be wrong, right? So the notion of having some anchor in a master-coded video or with the support of experts who have been accredited as master raters needs to be part of the system if we're committed to accuracy, not just consistency of ratings. So with that, we're going to pull up a poll, and if you can reflect on your own experience in your district or a district that you're familiar with, we'd be interested in whether you view yourself as at a level 1, 2, 3, or 4. Great. I think we've kind of settled in with a sense of the range of responses with almost, I guess, around 74% of people feeling that they're starting at a level 1 or 2, with about a quarter of people putting themselves at a 3 or 4. So clearly that's indicating that there's work to be done around this issue of accrediting observers and ensuring accuracy in the ratings of observers. Now we're going to go and do a couple more of these. This is really useful to have a sense of where the districts are, but I also would like you to think of going through an exercise like this with a team in your district as a way to get folks to reflect on the current state of affairs and potential work together to develop a plan for improving in these areas. So the next indicator is the training addresses giving and receiving feedback, which leads to more effective teaching. So the training enables observers, it is at a level 2, to give feedback that is mostly aligned to the rubric, but observers give teachers few opportunities to respond or contribute to the discussion. While strengths and areas of development are identified, there is no agreement on next steps or further monitoring. Whereas fully developed is described as the training enhances observers' skills in giving feedback. The professional dialogue with teachers is securely based on the components of the rubric. Where appropriate, the teacher is invited to contribute to identify areas for development and action steps, including further monitoring to track progress. So again, we're going to put up a poll quickly, and we'd ask you to indicate whether you feel you're starting at a 1, 2, 3, or 4 around the issue of observers being able to provide good feedback. Great. I think we're kind of settling in. So we have a little bit of a different distribution here with about 54% at a 1 or 2 and about 45%. Of course, my math is not on particularly strong display there, but we can all see the numbers and have a sense of where people think they are now and where we may need to focus some additional energy. So we're going to look at one more of these. This indicator is principals, assistant principals, and other observers have opportunities for paired observation to maintain inter-rater reliability. And I'm just going to let you read this one. We'll give you a moment to read the level 2 and level 4, and then we'll do one last poll. Okay, I think we can put the poll up. Okay, this appears to be the area where folks on the call feel there's the most room for growth, with about 80% scoring their district or district they're familiar with at a 1 or 2. So this is really interesting information, and hopefully gives us all some food for thought as we think about the work ahead in terms of improving in these areas. You can go ahead and hide that poll. In the resource that's available in the resources section, this is self-assessment tool. We have at the end of it a scoring sheet. Again, so I'd like you to imagine going through an exercise like we just went through with the team in your district, where you might compare notes after asking individuals to rate the district and identify common areas of strength and weakness and where there might be gaps in people's perceptions about where the district is strong or weak, with then a next step of moving towards developing some form of action plan to improve in these areas in a systematic and organized way. So that resource is available for you. Hopefully it's helpful as a way to kind of summarize a lot of what's covered today during the webinar, but also to maybe organize some follow-up conversations in your districts. I'm just going to touch quickly on an issue related to reliability and some learnings from the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching project in relation to observations and the combination of observations needed in order to maximize the reliability of results if the results are being used as part of a summative evaluation system. Now, this next slide may feel a bit overwhelming. If you can just work with me from left to right in a moment, rather than trying to absorb it all simultaneously. The height of the bar and the number in the bar represents levels of reliability based from the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching project research that was conducted over the past 3 or 4 years. And we see that when a single observer, so starting from the left, when a single observer observes one lesson, we have reliability level of 0.51. If we add a second observation, but with the same person doing the observation, it does move up in terms of level of reliability from 0.51 to 0.58. In the third bar, we still have two observations, but now two different people are conducting the observation. And we see a jump in the reliability levels when it's not only two observations, but two different people doing those observations. And then as we move to the right, we have a number of other different configurations involving, for example, in the fourth bar, a full observation by an administrator, and then three shorter observations by peer observers. So Christy was mentioning what the Gates Foundation has introduced in terms of some ideas about the impact on reliability of single observations versus single longer observations versus multiple observations but of a shorter length. And we see across here that there are a range of configurations that sort of hover in a pretty similar territory. And as we think about the implications of the number of observations required, if we go all the way to the right, it may just not be practical. But this is a particular part of the MET research that you might want to pursue as you think about the kind of combination of observations and the different configurations of people doing those observations in your districts. So mindful of time, I'm going to skip over and get it back to Christy to dig in a bit on the issue of feedback and in improving the instructional conversations and professional learning that's connected to the observation process.
Rob,
Thank
this
you,
is
Rob.
Elizabeth. Christy, I'm sorry. This is Elizabeth. I think there's actually a few questions about that slide. I think it might be helpful if we address them before we move on, because I see some questions coming in. If we can just, I'm going to go back to that previous slide. Rob, I think people are asking about, one in particular, are the double observations of the same lesson at the same time?
I believe that those are two different lessons.
Okay, two different lessons by two different people. And the other question,
right. So the second and third bar, in one case it's two lessons and the same person is doing it, and the third it's two lessons and two different people are doing it.
Okay, that makes sense. And then David is asking about the 5 bars to the right. Are they statistically different?
The 5 bars to the
I have
right.
an answer to that.
You mean the range from 0.67 to 0.72?
I believe that's what David's asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that most people who have looked at this have looked at the bars over to the right, and given the sort of impact in terms of different levels of reliability and the realities of what's practical in terms of implementation, have sort of concluded that that's probably not necessary, although, of course, anything that can be done to increase reliability is important, right? But I think this brings us back to the whole issue of multiple measures. That is, we want for each of these measures to get as high levels of reliability as is possible, but within what is practical. And there's a trade-off between reliability and implementing something that's feasible. So most places that we're working with, I think, are seeing the multiple measures as part of influencing decisions about how many observations need to be done.
Great. That's really helpful, and I think you touched on a few other comments.
Yeah, and Derek's question that just came up about the cost effectiveness of doing this level of observation is obviously something that at a policy level needs to be understood as we look at the impact of even just going from one observation by one administrator to multiple observations. But Kelly has also brought up concern around the lower levels of reliability and whether that's crossing an acceptable threshold given the high-stakes nature of this information or these scores if they're being used in an evaluative context with high stakes. So these are, of course, the issues that educators across the country are wrestling with. And in the interest of time, I think we should probably move on, but maybe you can come back to some additional questions on this at the end if we have time.
Great. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, let me get us back to where we were so we can go ahead and start talking about feedback. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that observation in and of itself does not have a very favorable long-term impact on teacher instruction, but it's the other components as well that add to the process and certainly to the ability for teachers to make improvement in their instruction. And certainly feedback, the feedback is one of the key pieces that have the ability to make that difference in teacher instruction. So when we think about conversations and professional learning, the quote here that we're seeing from the U.S. Department of Education, to have an effective teacher evaluation system, you need good trained evaluators and more time from teachers and administrators to discuss performance and improve teaching and learning. And that really is the crucial piece here. As you start thinking about even what teachers do in their classroom and how feedback impacts student performance, you can make those same connections to the teacher learning. In classrooms, we expect teachers to certainly do more than put a grade on top of a student test. It's that taking the test, giving it back out, going over it with the students, and talking about what they missed, what they did well, and how that connects to the next phase of learning for them. So the feedback piece is crucial in learning. Likely as well for the teachers. If we go into a classroom and observe teachers and just come back out and say, great job, that non-specific feedback doesn't really tell them what was so good about what was seen, and then certainly where they need to improve. So it's just important that we make sure we are fine-tuning the feedback process. So, how are we taking that information about what teachers are doing and using it as a basis for improvement? There is great skill needed in providing a feedback or holding a feedback conference with a teacher. The feedback in and of itself should not be evaluative of a teacher. It's more of a descriptive conference and type of language that's used to speak with the teacher. Most often, I find in working with administrators who are questioning about how to start a feedback conference, I'll share with them, have your teacher, before they come in, think about things that went well in their lesson and things that didn't go so well, so that as the teacher comes in, they have an opportunity to reflect and respond to that first. The feedback is not just about what we are sharing and giving to the teacher, but also about their ability to reflect and certainly be able to participate in that conversation. So we've got a poll here just thinking about brainstorming about quality feedback. Quality feedback to teachers has been limited. So in a few words, I'd like to ask you to share why you think that has been the case. And this is just a free type. Just share a few words if you'd like about why you think that quality feedback to teachers has been so limited throughout the years. Yeah, I'm seeing time pop up quite a bit here. Yeah, time has certainly been one of the big ones that many districts are sharing. Lack of knowledge. I'm seeing that as well. Lack of knowledge. Y'all are hitting on really some of the top ones that I'm hearing from other districts and other states and from teachers. Sometimes there's that lack of instructional knowledge from the evaluators. Still, again, seeing a lot of time issues, lack of collaboration. Some really great responses coming through of your observations about that quality feedback having been limited. Okay. Yeah, and having hard conversations, that's certainly going to be another area that we're going to talk about. There is definitely a little bit of that discomfort for some to provide that feedback to a teacher, because most often it does deal with having some of the hard conversations. And oftentimes we find that that's just uncomfortable for administrators to do. You know, as we rolled out the new teacher evaluation processes throughout the U.S., you know, many administrators stayed in their same schools, and I know many of the evaluation systems that were previously used were a lot of tally marks and check boxes, and teachers predominantly throughout the U.S. were rated satisfactory. You either met expectations or you didn't. So now we're coming back and we're having to switch the entire culture and the way this evaluation, this new evaluation is handled, and the types of conversations that it is requiring. So those hard conversations are difficult to have because we're not used to having had them. So, all right, so let's go ahead and move on and look at our next slide. So why do we think that quality of feedback is limited? And all of the things we've listed here are many of the issues that you typed in just a moment ago on that poll. What we've seen is that the leadership has just been able to effectively deliver that feedback and provide the support. And when we ask ourselves why that is the case, and as many of you said, it's because of that limited training and knowledge about instructional practices and the high-quality teaching. So in years past, when we had leaders who were more managers than they were instructional leaders, you know, we just didn't have that emphasis on the leadership as instructional leadership as we do now. The accountability for student learning just wasn't at the level that it is now. Certainly the competing demands on time, all of you mentioned, and that's where we have to start looking at how we are using our time and managing it and delegating. And I know that even when we have 48 hours in a day, we always need, it seems like, 72. Operational demands take the front seat, and again, that's just thinking of administrators of the past and how it was more about being an operational leader, a manager, rather than looking at instruction. So I like this quote from Grant Wiggins because it is so applicable, again, as I shared earlier, to teachers and the feedback that they need. You know, when we think about students in the classroom, it's not just about the advice we give them. It's not about just giving them grades. That isn't what constitutes the feedback, nor does giving a teacher just a rating or a form with a signature saying that they've met expectations. We're going to see the greatest improvement in teachers based on the information shared during that feedback conference. So true feedback and how we give it is what's going to impact teacher learning the most. And as someone shared a while ago in their comments during that poll, it is about the culture. How are we creating a positive school culture, and are we from day one? And are we setting that clear vision and mission, making sure that we've got the clarity in our curriculum and we've got high-quality assessment, good classroom materials, technology, time for teachers to engage in meaningful work, and smooth operations throughout the school. But that support and that school culture and letting teachers know that administrators are right there with them in the trenches and standing by them to support and help come up with ways to improve their teaching is what is so crucial. Let's look at this next poll.
This is Rob, and I'm wondering if we can just pause here for a moment. There were a number of comments and dialogue among the participants, and I think particularly I wanted to acknowledge the comments people made about the important benefits of paired observation and work in teams around this process of observation and even the kind of support that can follow up the observation that kind of goes outside of the objective of trying to get as reliable a rating as is possible. That is to say, what I was interpreting people to share is that, of course, we want to get reliable results for the summative measure, but there also are important benefits in terms of leadership development for the people that are doing the work of observations together in the same classroom in some instances, but also involving even peer observers in the process together with administrators and the benefits in building a culture of trust and collaboration. I'm wondering if you can just share some of your experience with that type of work in the field, and if people have additional comments about your own experiences, perhaps you can share those in the content box to the left.
Sure, absolutely. And that's a great point, Rob, a great conversation, because now with many of the evaluation processes defined in districts to include peer evaluators, some districts call them peer mentors. I know there are some variances in how the terminology is used, but in many of the districts, the same training that administrators, school principals and assistant principals are going through, peer evaluators and mentors are going through the same training. And that is merely and most importantly to ensure that we have a consistency in the process and in the people who are providing ratings and feedback to teachers, to ensure that we're all delivering the same message and making sure that our ratings are aligning. And that's really important because, where districts are investing the money in peer evaluators, as we've learned from much of the research that is ongoing right now, the multiple observers brings great reliability to the process. So having those peer evaluators and mentors train with the school administrators and go through the calibration process has really stepped up the reliability in districts and the ability to provide accurate ratings. So that has something that has been really increasing throughout many of the states and the districts. And yes, it has been a cost investment, but from what I am learning in working with many of these districts is that it is a minimal cost compared to what could happen if we do not have reliability and comparable information being shared in a district, especially as we get closer to that pay-for-performance piece. The cost of that at the end can be much greater than having the inaccuracy of data within our districts.
I think another comment that was shared earlier is the issue of needing to provide training for teachers as well, so that they understand what the effective practices are that they're going to be observed on through the observation process. And in the self-assessment resource that we shared with you, that's one of the indicators in there that we didn't cover during the polling. But again, Christy, I'm just wondering from your experience if you could say a word or two about the process that you've seen that works most effectively in terms of engaging teachers in training activities that help them understand the process, but through that training also provide better scaffolding for their own work to improve.
Yeah, and I got most of what you said, I believe, Rob. It was a little muffled on this end, but I think what I got out of that was about the training for teachers as well. And yeah, it's impossible to train administrators without making sure that teachers have received training that is certainly equally as informative, because they're the ones who feel like in this whole process that it's being done to them instead of with them. So we have been working very closely with many districts to also train their teachers. In training administrators and evaluators, we've been asked to come back and provide that same training in effective classroom observation with many of the teachers as well, because sometimes they certainly want to hear it from someone else other than their own district. So teachers have to have a quality and level of training to really feel like they're more knowledgeable in the process and that they're ready not to compete, if you will, with the administrators and evaluators, but that they can do what is expected of them in terms of effective instruction for students. So, yeah, the training for teachers is crucial, and that can be done, in various ways. Again, going back to, I know Marzano and Danielson both have the rigorous training processes built into their platforms, and certainly, we're doing a lot of the face-to-face training with the teachers and administrators as well. Does that kind of cover, Rob, what you had asked me?
Yeah, you got it. So thank you for
Okay,
that,
thank you.
and maybe we can go to the poll. Now this poll is a little bit redundant maybe with the previous poll, given particularly the focus that many of you had in your responses. But sort of moving back to the issue of feedback, imagining that the observation process is successful and we've built the capacity around good observation, and they're in that moment where there's a conversation occurring between observer and teacher. Oftentimes we see and have experienced even ourselves as teachers that there's a hesitation to actually deliver feedback about areas that need to be improved. And in the same way as the previous poll, we'd like you to just share a few words about what you think it is in that moment between teacher and observer that gets in the way of delivering honest feedback focused on areas of improvement. Excellent.
Yeah, these are some really great comments that are coming in. And yeah, and so as you're typing, I'm just going to make a couple of comments just for the sake of time. The lack of confidence I'm seeing, fear of hurting others' feelings. It's most important in these feedback conferences that we are making sure that the language we use is not personal language. If we keep our comments tied to student learning and practices that impact student learning favorably or negatively, these conferences tend to go better than some expect. Because most teachers, you know, at the end of the day, they want their students to learn and do better. So making sure that our language is not used as a personal attack, if you will, but more that it centers around student learning. Yeah, and other comments coming through, lack of pedagogically strong observers, thought that it's tied to your job. And in reading many of these again, I just have to come back to, at the end of the day, as administrators and evaluators, again, we have to remember what our number one responsibility is, and it's to the student learning, the students in our schools. So knowing that principals have the greatest impact on teachers and their instruction, and that teachers have the largest impact on student learning is just certainly a direction and a point to remember.
Hey, Christy, Derek has just asked a question. You know, your emphasis on the focus not just being on teacher actions, but on the relationship between teacher actions and student learning observed in the classroom is a sort of been a theme in your comments. And he's asking if you could give an example of feedback that is not about the teaching practice, but about student learning. And of course, well, anyhow, I'll just let you speak to that and maybe clarify what you mean by making sure that student learning is in the mix.
Right, absolutely. And, you know, the majority of, I believe, the states that are listening in today, predominantly, I believe, are using some version of Charlotte Danielson's framework. Certainly there may be some others out there. But, you know, when you are thinking about feedback for student learning, I'm focusing in a feedback conference around whether or not I gauged, based on my evidence, there was student learning that occurred. So first of all, we've got to have that ability to be able to recognize that before we can even give the feedback. But I'm assessing, looking at instruction. If I'm speaking to a teacher, I might say, I noticed after, and I'm just going to use this as an example, having been a previous English major, I noticed during teaching about verb conjugation that you really didn't stick with Jonathan as you were probing for his understanding of how to conjugate the verb run. And I might say, can you share with me how you think you could have handled that a little bit differently? or if something certainly goes well. Most often we're not having those conversations about what went really well in depth. We're talking about them, but more so are we actually focused on where the weaknesses are. So in assessing whether or not the students learned, I'm going to come back to how the teacher and whether or not they were flexible and responsive to whether or not learning was taking place, and then how they knew whether or not the students were getting the information or certainly the objective or essential question of the day. So if you come back to how the teacher assessed the learning, that certainly is the feedback about student learning. And Derek, I'm not sure if I'm getting you the exact answer there you're looking for, but if not, please type back in and let me know. But feedback about student learning certainly has to center around how the teacher assessed for that learning. Did they or did they not? Okay, great, Derek. I'm glad we got that for you. Okay, so let's move on past this slide. Let's see if we can. Professional learning, and again, this is the end result of what happens with feedback. You know, if we are giving feedback and we don't connect it to next steps, then we're missing the boat of the purpose of feedback. So as Charlotte Danielson comments here about professional learning, saying that there's a commitment to professional learning, it's important, not because teaching is poor quality, but really because it's just so hard we can always improve it. And I make that point about myself every day when I'm training and when I'm working with administrators. You know, anyone in education probably or should feel like we are lifelong learners. And certainly as educators and expecting our students to be of such, we have to be able to know that everything we do every day isn't always perfect, and we can always make improvements in what we do. And so the best way for us as administrators and evaluators to make that point is to live it and breathe it every day. So if we live it and breathe it and we're always in that learning mode, and helping our teachers understand that being in that learning mode and having that constant drive to improve what we do, that's what's going to make the difference at the end of the day in terms of our instruction. So as we link evaluation and professional learning, and there certainly needs to be a link, because again, the observation in and of itself isn't what's going to be changing student learning. Making sure that we have those standards for instruction, high quality standards, whether it be Common Core, in Florida, Sunshine State standards, whatever may be being used, making sure that they're high quality standards for instruction. Using those multiple standard-based measures of teacher effectiveness. We've talked a lot today about the teacher observation in and of itself as a means of evaluating teachers, but we know certainly that there are other things out there, making sure that student perception surveys are used, multiple observers, using value-added data, and certainly there are many others there as well. The high-quality training on the standards, tools, and measures, again, we have to put our money where our mouth is. We can talk till, you know, the day's end about new teacher evaluation and the frameworks we're using, but if we're not training people in the tools to be the best they can be and using them, we're missing a part of this process to prepare people to perform at the level expected. So trained individuals to interpret results and make professional development recommendations, that's what we have to become as administrators and evaluators, trained in the forms and the processes we're using, and making sure that the professional development recommendations that we're making based on the observations we've made in a classroom are things that will truly impact teacher performance. Teachers need that opportunity to grow professionally, and we can support them certainly at the end of the day by suggesting areas of improvement and making that happen for them. It's not enough for us to be able to say, okay, here's where you're weak, you know, struggling a little bit in the questioning area, go see what you can do about it. We have to help provide that in our districts. How are they going to get that training? And it certainly has to be timely, as does that feedback to a teacher. So if we're waiting 2 weeks after an observation to feedback to a teacher, then certainly we're not giving that timely feedback. And what happens as a result of that, the students are not getting the level of instruction that they need because the teachers aren't making the improvement. So this is kind of a synopsis here of what we're talking about, and linking the evaluation to the professional learning must be individualized for teachers because we know they all differ in their abilities in delivering effective instruction in the classroom. So as we think about bringing this here to an end, love this as where observation, the rubber meets the road, we have to step back and take a hard look at instructional leadership. If we're not making sure that we're hiring leaders in our schools that are instructional leaders, we need to step back and look at our hiring processes. So in considering how we hire our administrators and our school leaders, we need to be thinking also about how the frameworks we're using for evaluation are used in that hiring process to ensure that we're getting the most qualified people. The feedback to teachers must be as effective as are the expectations that we expect teachers to have in their instruction. The effective feedback to teachers is what's going to help drive that ability and that desire to want to improve. And then certainly basis for goal setting and professional learning, we've got to make sure that we're providing evidence of data collected and providing goal-oriented comments back to the teacher, and not just, it wasn't so great, here's where you did a great job, but making sure that they connect that information to effective instruction and to the frameworks that we're using. Just like telling a teacher, and I'll wrap it up with this, rather than saying that, I like the way you greeted your students as they came in the door. It's more about, I really like the way you greeted your students when they came in the door because you made specific connections with individual students and made them feel that you really cared about them. So again, making sure it's specific feedback, that it's tied to student learning, and that they know that we're right there in it with them and we're going to support them to be the best that they can be.
Thanks so much,
Okay,
Christy.
so yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No problem. That was a lot of information that we covered, and I know there have been quite a lot of questions coming in and comments, so we're going to reserve some time for that. But before we jump into the Q&A session, I wanted to take a moment to find out from our audience, what action steps do you all plan to take as a result of what you heard today? We saw throughout the webinar some of the comments related to where you stand in your districts and your states currently with this classroom observation piece. But now we'd like to know, what do you intend to do with the information you heard today? Looks like several folks are planning to use this as part of their training and to incorporate some of the ideas in training for observers.
Yeah, I really like there are many comments coming through, certainly about the self-assessment tool, because, we don't know where to go if we're not assessing ourselves to see where we are. So I think that's just a great start.
I saw several comments earlier and again here related to teacher preparation and the way that higher ed can coordinate and collaborate with our K-12 systems to ensure that we're all speaking the same language, and to understand when teachers do get to the classroom, what the higher ed folks can do to prepare them best for what they're going to find in terms of the evaluation and what they're going to be accountable for.
That's a great point, Elizabeth, and I would love to have a moment just to chat about that, because actually that is one of the trainings that I had certainly conducted for a lot of teacher prep programs for various universities that were feeding into one of the school districts, or the school district that I had worked in, and because we were hiring so many teachers who were coming from those teacher prep programs in those schools, they came in already having that knowledge. So that is a great, great idea. I like having that brought up. That just puts them one step ahead of the game, so that's super.
That's great, Christy. I think maybe that needs to be happening in more places, and it would help those novice teachers have that leg up when they enter the classroom.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yes. I like to also, I appreciate those of you who are making those connections with keeping student learning as the central focus of observations and the reason for doing what we do when it comes to observing teachers and providing feedback. Keeping all of those conversations and our purpose certainly centralizing around student learning, because that is what it's all about.
And Rob, I see a few people commenting about the reliability aspect and what you spoke about a little bit earlier, but do you have any concrete suggestions for people to take away in reference to that and ensuring that they can go back and promote this idea of inter-rater reliability among observers?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking with some of the other questions that came up, I think there must be a good resource that we could identify that we might distribute out to the participants that would provide a good summary overview. I don't have something immediately in mind, but it feels, based on this theme, particularly in the comments here in the final poll, that identifying a good resource that might be useful as a reference point is something that we should focus on, Elizabeth, as a follow-up.
Sure, and I'll just go ahead.
And I was just going to say, again, and if we're incorrect about this based on the bit of research we did about the states involved here and many of your use of Danielson, certainly the resources that Charlotte has been organizing with Teachscape are something that should be looked at carefully to support both the accuracy issue, but also to provide support for teachers and to address the inter-rater reliability issue. So hopefully people are familiar with those resources that Charlotte, ETS, and Teachscape have been putting together if you're in fact largely Danielson-focused districts.
That's great, Rob. And what I was going to say is that when we're finished with the webinar and you all go to the REL Mid-Atlantic website and go to the page for this particular webinar, in about a week you'll see the resources associated with this webinar. So you'll see the presentation from today, the self-assessment tool, but we will also be compiling a frequently asked questions document, and within that document there will be a list of resources. So we'll be compiling any resources that Rob and Christy have suggested today, as well as some others that we'll gather that will support some of the questions that you've asked. So be on the lookout for that in the coming week.
And it looks like John has shared another one of the resources from the MET project that might be useful to share with other folks as well. Thanks, John.
Great. So it sounds like people have a lot of work to do in this area and some really great and concrete ideas for going back to your schools, going back to your districts as researchers, going back to do the support for schools and districts, and to really make this piece of measuring teacher effectiveness one that is effective and hones in on teachers and then really gets at that student learning that Christy has been very eagerly promoting today. And at this point, we want to take some time to answer some more of your questions. I know a lot of them came in today through the webinar, and we got quite a few in the registration prior to the webinar. So we want to definitely take the opportunity to address some of those over the next 15 minutes or so. If you found that the question you asked on the left-hand side in the content box hasn't been addressed yet, please type it again into the question and answer box that's going to be coming up on the screen. And we'll also be pulling from some of the pre-registration questions that came in. One question that I do know came up, Rob and Christy, and you guys can decide, who wants to address it, but this idea that there may at times be observers who are not familiar with the content area in which they're observing. And what's your perspective on that, and how should those observations and feedback discussions be structured so that both the observer and the teacher can benefit from that experience?
Yeah, I would love to address that, Elizabeth. Thank you. Good instruction is good instruction, first of all, and that's something that we do know and can recognize when we're in a classroom. The issue I think that some people will have is that sometimes, for example, you put me in an AP calculus class, and I'm probably going to be less likely to know if the teacher makes a mistake with the content. However, the pre-conference really comes in handy in that respect because I'm expecting the teacher to share with me what they're covering and how it connects in the scheme of learning for those particular students. I've often had conversations around observations that have perhaps been at a content level that was a little bit higher than perhaps what I studied or what I was familiar with, just to sometimes clarify a question about the content. But what I found is that when it comes to instruction, good instructional practice and strategies are the same across the board, and most often it does not come down to not knowing the content as far as impacting the ability to observe that particular lesson.
That's great, Christy. That's helpful. One of the other questions.
Most of the observation rubrics, of course, that people are using are not content specific. So there are examples, of course, of rubrics and observation rubrics that have a content focus, but I think most of what people are using are kind of agnostic on the specific content or course that's being delivered. I wanted to just touch on this question that David has shared, and I think what I'm understanding in the question is this potential tension between the reality of evaluation systems being implemented across the country, oftentimes with much higher stakes involved, and at the same time, kind of the theme that we've tried to emphasize, which is the point and outcome of good evaluation systems should be professional growth for educators. And Christy, I'm wondering if you can speak in your experience about how you've seen districts handling that tension and what may seem like opposing objectives, one around holding somebody accountable and increasing the stakes of accountability while at the same time trying to focus on growth and improvement.
Rob, were you talking about that in relation to PD? I'm sorry, I actually clicked an X, and I believe I deleted that question on accident. Can you?
Yeah, just the extent to which, in your experiences, this tension between the emphasis on professional development versus the emphasis on evaluation, how my initial slide with the seesaw and trying to find that balance, are those actually at cross purposes, and how do we rationalize, on the one hand, increasing accountability, on the other hand, trying to create a culture that's focused on growth and professional learning?
Well, I think because many states and departments of education have insisted that professional development programs be increased and truly monitored and provide data that shows the impact on student learning. I mean, we have to make sure that there is accountability, and this is a question that someone else was also raising as well about the professional development and how do we assess that. There has to be accountability certainly for the teacher performance in the classroom because of student learning, but then we have that responsibility as administrators, school leaders, and certainly districts to make sure that we're providing that research-based quality professional development to help the teachers improve. So it's like, giving them one piece of the puzzle and expecting them to connect or finish the puzzle without the, other piece or pieces. So we have an obligation to our teachers to make sure that if we're going to tell them how they need to improve or that they need to improve, that we then have to be able to give them those strategies how and then programs or processes to do that in manners that are research-based and proven to improve student learning. So I certainly think we have that responsibility to our teachers to provide that for them if we're going to expect the instruction to increase.
Christy and Rob, another question that I saw come in was related to video, use of videos in observing, and what is your experience with that, and have you seen it being used effectively?
Yeah, this is an area where we have less direct experience. There are a number of organizations that are doing a lot of work around the use of video in the observation process in terms of actually as in the capturing lessons through video instead of live observations. We're probably not in the best position to speak to that, but again, maybe you could follow up with some resources and links to organizations that are focused on that in particular. Of course, there's then the use of video to support the training process, which is and to support the accreditation process, for example, through master-coded videos. That's an area where we have more experience, but I think it was the former that you might have been asking about, and I think we should follow up with some examples of resources and organizations that have focused in on the use of video rather than live observations.
Yeah, great. That's great, Rob. We'll definitely investigate that and include that in the FAQ document.
Elizabeth, can I address a question that Derek has here about data that we use to assess PD? Because I know so often that we don't make decisions about what we've done in schools and whether or not it's working until we get student test scores at the end of the year, and sometimes those aren't coming until the beginning of the next school year. So this is where it is just imperative to have continuous presence in classrooms to make sure that we are seeing strategies being used and implemented that we are working with our teachers on, whether it be in school-wide professional development, whether it be strategies they're using and working on in their PLCs. But that's where our presence in the classrooms has to be made more frequent so that we can monitor how those new strategies and practices are being used and whether or not we're seeing an impact on student learning. And I know with a lot of the data chats that are taking place in more and more districts, there seems to be more of a monitoring of that data on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis to see what the impacts are and the effects on student learning based on the new strategies and PD that teachers are going through and implementing.
So Alka has just shared some important information about an extension to the MET project where 15,000 lessons have been videoed, it sounds like, to create a library of practice and will be available in early 2014. So it sounds like that's certainly something we should stay tuned about. And I want to look at Yvonne's question here where she asked, are there programs that include self-evaluations that teachers could use? This could be less threatening. And Christy, I don't know if you can speak at all to how you've seen teachers using rubrics like the framework for teaching on their own, not necessarily just in response to the evaluation process?
I know that there are, again, many districts who ask teachers to self-assess after an observation, and I know that those are used certainly in those feedback conferences just to have talking points so the teachers can begin to see where, their interpretation of what's effective and what's not effective, and then certainly the administrator or peer evaluator who's been calibrated, where they can see where those areas are. When that is used in that process, that as well is not a threatening process. I think that conversation and getting teachers to begin self-assessing, self-evaluating, having a buddy teacher come in and watch their teaching and provide feedback for them. And I know a while ago certainly the video piece was brought up, but, teachers, there are many teachers who have started to video themselves and watch the video back to have that, to self-assess their own teaching. It's kind of that same premise. You hear yourself sometimes at the end of a video recorder or on a cassette tape or on a voicemail, and you think to yourself, is that what I really sound like? And it's the same thing with watching yourself teach. We don't always recognize and observe what we do when we're in the moment doing it. But as far as a program in and of itself that includes a self-evaluation, I can't think of one just right off the top of my head.
And I think, Christy, the big picture with that is even, our best teachers who want to do that and do their self-assessments and engage in peer observations, the challenge, again, is time, what everyone talked about earlier. And so finding the time to do that and making that the priority, I think, is where that becomes challenging for folks.
Right, and I totally understand that time piece. I know that with the use of all kinds of technology these days and handheld devices, I know it's certainly, there's certainly there are more opportunities that are readily available to make that happen, but then I know you certainly have the time to go back and watch something like that, or the time that it does take to self-assess. But again, this is where we start really focusing on that culture that we're building within our buildings to make sure that teachers see the value in that professional growth. So some of that has to be started at that level, just in culture and environment within a building.
I'm going to
see Aaron's question about specific tips for private schools, and I think hopefully much of what we've talked about today is relevant and applicable. Of course, we oftentimes are referring to district and state policy, which may not apply in the same way to private schools, but the principles of improving observation in order to inform and serve as a catalyst for growth and improvement, I think applies similarly in whatever setting we happen to be teaching in.
Thanks, Rob. I just want to wrap up with one last question, and this relates to administrators and their evaluations, and thinking about how effective administrators are at doing these observations, conducting effective observations. How have you seen this play into administrators' evaluation for schools and districts and how they're being rated?
Christy, do you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, Rob, did you want me to take it?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry, I didn't know if I was talking over you. I apologize. It certainly is playing into the new administrator evaluations, because certainly part of what administrators are expected to know and do is to be able to observe effective instruction and to share effective instructional practices and strategies with their teachers to improve student learning. So their skills and abilities in doing all of these different pieces of the teacher observation are part of what they're being assessed by on their administrator evaluation. So I know just recently we've been doing a lot of work with districts on the principal school leader evaluations and helping them be able to ensure that they're, certainly getting the best out of their evaluation that they can, because they are very much held accountable for the learning in their buildings from students, and certainly that level of teacher instruction. So there's a big connection between the two, and as we are moving into some states, second, third, fourth year into teacher evaluation, they're now really starting to turn and take a look at that leadership assessment as well.
Super. Thanks, Christy, for touching on that. I'd like now to just give a virtual round of applause to Rob and Christy for taking the time out today and sharing their valuable expertise on classroom observations. It's clear that people are interested in this issue and there's a lot of work to do, so we do hope that the information you've heard is useful and that the continued conversation at our forum and the resources we'll be able to provide to you will be useful in your practice. And you can see here on the slide right now, Cambridge Education's website if you want to find out more about the work they're doing. And you'll see our personal contact information if you do have any questions about this webinar or any of our future webinars. Please do reach out to any of us. I'll also point out that when you do your feedback survey today, there will be an opportunity to listen with your feedback in mind. So please be honest and provide us with input. At this time, we're going to be wrapping up, and we wish you all a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate you sharing all of that good information. Hope we've helped.